In this video, we're going to talk about the role of slavery at the Constitutional Convention. At the convention, one of the big cleavages was between large states and small states. Could they negotiate an agreement that would produce a system of government that allowed for the protection of both of those interests? And they came up with a republic, which was a federal system that separated powers between three different branches of government. However, there was another cleavage that emerged at the Constitutional Convention. That was the interest of slave states versus free states. The issue of slavery really dominated the discussion and underpinned some of these key negotiations. For instance, the Great Compromise. The Great Compromise provided for bicameral representation. The Senate would be equal. Each state would get 2 representatives in the Senate. That would be pretty easy to figure out. The House of Representatives would be allocated by population. Each region, each state would be awarded seats based on their population. However, what about the enslaved population? Should they count in that calculation? Because they weren't really treated as people in the southern states. They were treated as property. Should property count as representation in Congress? That was a big sticking point. And I'll just give you some numbers for the sake of illustration. Look at Georgia and Maine. Population roughly equal at the time of negotiation. However, 35% of Georgia's population were enslaved. So which number should Georgia get credit for? Should they get almost the same number of seats as Maine because of their total population? Or should they get a lot less because a third of their population is enslaved? Same goes for Maryland versus Massachusetts. Again, roughly the same total number of seats if they were based on total population. However, almost a third of Maryland's population is enslaved. Should their representation in Congress be reduced by that? They would argue that no, it shouldn't. So this was a big sticking point. There were 2 very different versions of counting people for the purposes of apportionment. That means to determine how many seats each state would have. The compromise put forth by the free states was that very simple. 5 citizens, 5 votes. However, slaves should not count at all. If you're not going to treat them as free citizens, they should not count in your representation formula. On the other side, the southern states said no, absolutely, they should count. 5 slaves should count as 5 people. And we should get compensated accordingly. Like most things, at the convention, a compromise was reached. And the compromise was to count slaves as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of apportionment. Now, what sort of effect would that have? Well, Rhode Island, for example, who eventually did sign the Constitution, they ratified it, had 15,000 more free citizens than Georgia, but Georgia got 1 more seat because it had 30,000 slaves. New Jersey, 30,000 more free people than South Carolina, but South Carolina gets more seats because of its slave population. When you consider this, combining it with the Senate, where the states were all represented equally, this ensured that the South, slave states, were overrepresented in Congress. They would have disproportionate influence within the federal system and within the legislative branch. In addition to the 3/5 compromise, there were some other passages in the Constitution that dealt specifically with slavery. For example, Article 1, Section 9, the Importation Clause. The migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit can't be banned by Congress. Congress can't ban the slave trade. And notice they went out of their way not to say slavery. They are clearly talking about slavery. Any such persons as the states want to admit. Same with Article 4, Section 2, the Fugitive Slave Clause. No person held to labor or service in one state. If they escape, they can't become free citizens. The federal government must return them back to the state from which they escaped. So that's, again, going out of their way not to say the word slavery, but clearly talking about slavery. And if we think about the whole underlying principle here that you don't want the federal government to have too much power, here we've got slave states suggesting that if their slaves escape, the federal government must return them. So that's a lot. There's a lot of slavery in the Constitution, even though they went out of their way to try to avoid saying the word slavery. And this is because the southern states, the slave states, were very wary of the growing anti-slavery sentiment in the North. They did not want to join a government if that government was going to turn around and say slavery would be banned. So that's why they were happy to have a Senate where states were guaranteed equal representation. It could ensure that they could block legislation about slavery. The Electoral College, which was based on that formula, would also give them more influence in that process. The 3/5 compromise would ensure that they would be overrepresented in the House to make sure they could combat any legislation to ban slavery. Of course, the importation clause, Congress can't stop slaves from being imported for a period of time. And then the fugitive slave clause, the federal government must return slaves that escape. So all of these things were designed so that the slave states, the southern states, could ensure that Congress could not legislate slavery. They could not pass a law that would make slavery become illegal. That was their compromise. We will not join a government unless we can ensure that it won't ban slavery.